In other words, before you throw the ball, in your mind's eye, you play a little movie of yourself succeeding at that. You visualize yourself throwing the ball and having it go right into the basket, or dashing down the 100 meters in 8 seconds, or whatever. Down the 100 meters in 8 seconds, or whatever it is. And it's just a way to build your self-confidence. In a sense, if you've seen yourself do it in your mind's eye, you can do it more easily when it comes time to do the real thing, and this works for delivering speeches as well. If before you are introduced, before you walk out onto the stage, if you can visualize yourself walking out with self-confidence, with a strong spring in your step and a smile on your face perhaps, and then deliver a very, very effective, useful presentation to an audience which receives it with a lot of appreciation. If you can visualize yourself doing that beforehand, that can help you a lot with nervousness. So let's talk briefly now about what I call death by PowerPoint. How often have you seen PowerPoint presentations that have too much information, or that are difficult to read because there's so much data crammed onto the slide, for example, or the presenter is just going on and trying to get you to understand something that's on the screen, and you just, no matter how hard you try, you are bored to death, like this unfortunate individual in the image that you see right here. Well, once again, we're all different. We all have different goals in business. Some of the information that some of us have to present is more complex, of course, than information that others of us have to present. But just as a general rule, I very much like this quote from a professor at Yale named Dr. Edward Tufte. He says, "Graphical excellence consists of complex ideas that are communicated with clarity, precision, and efficiency." Right? So what's an example of the opposite of that? Well, here's a slide. This is a client I worked with many years ago. This company actually doesn't exist anymore. A slide like this is absolutely confusing in my view and not useful. When you are presenting, you want the audience to pay attention to the story that you're telling, and you want the audience to be able to absorb the visuals in a way that complements the story that you're telling. Once again, Steve Jobs was brilliant at that. When Steve Jobs would deliver a presentation, he didn't have a lot of words, a lot of things flying around the screen. He had very, very simple visual images, right? So this is an example of what not to do. Here's another example of what not to do. The American general, General Stanley McChrystal, who was in charge of the American military effort in Afghanistan, used to use this slide to try to explain what the United States was trying to do. And as you can see, if you were sitting in the fourth row, or maybe even the second row, there's so much information on this screen that you can't read it. And you certainly wouldn't be able to listen to the speaker and pay attention to what he's saying at the same time. So something like this might work as a handout, as something that you could sit and study on your own quietly for a half an hour, but it certainly doesn't work for a live presentation. And here's another bad example. This is a slide. You don't want to put too many words on a slide. The best kinds of visuals are a combination of nice, simple photographs is what I prefer, and a few well-chosen words. It's not a reading exercise, and you as the presenter, your job is not to stand there and narrate the slides, to walk the audience through the slides. If you're going to do that, it begs the question, well, why am I even showing up in the first place? Why don't I just email all of these words to my audience and not make the effort to actually be there in person? And the answer, of course, is if you can be there in person, there are things that you can achieve by that face-to-face contact that you can't achieve with an email. But if you're going to use visuals that look like this, your audience will simply tune out. And here are a couple of other ghastly examples that I've seen in our travels here at Oratorio. Once again, you can't read this from the back of the room. You can't read something like this from the back of the room, right? So there aren't really any hard and fast specific rules, but just generally speaking, I like for you to think of in terms of limiting the content on the slide. There's nothing wrong with bullet points, but 3 or 4 of them probably is enough for one slide. Don't put 25 bullet points on a single slide. And then a question that I'm always asked is, well, I've got more detailed information that I need to share with this audience. How do I do that if my slides need to be fairly simple? And my response to that is make 2 versions of the presentation. Make a more detailed version, which will serve as a handout, which you will give your audience after you finish speaking. That's very important not to give it to them beforehand, because if you give it to them beforehand, they'll be flipping through it when you want them paying attention to you. No, deliver the simpler version in the live context and then give them handouts to work with afterward. And maintain a fairly consistent graphic style. I say avoid clip art. Many of you may be familiar with clip art. It's embedded within Microsoft PowerPoint. I think that it's kind of cheap looking, and I think it's better to simply use good photographs, right? And we're often asked, well, what are good sources for photographs? There are a number of different stock photo services that you can find online. There's one called gettyimages.com. There's another called istockphoto.com, another one called shutterstock.com. If you simply Google stock photography, you can find a number of good examples. Now, just very quickly, here's an example of a slide that I think is very effective. This is a very undetailed slide. This is a client of ours from a couple of years ago, an architecture firm that simply needed to talk about the big top-line numbers. And so they decided to make it very simple and very, very colorful. And in fact, the CEO of this company went on to tell the story in another, what I thought was very creative and visual way. He said, last year, in the depths of the recession, we really were staring into the precipice. And it was very, very difficult, but we all decided we were going to get into the boats together and start rowing. The waters were very rough, but we paddled very hard. And then all of a sudden, eventually, we could see that there was a little bit of sunlight beginning to appear on the horizon. And now we find ourselves at the beginning of a new path, a new journey, right? I'm not saying that this kind of extremely visual approach always works in every kind of context, but I want you to think a little bit like Steve Jobs. I want you to think more visually. What are some ways that you can push yourselves in this general direction? And finally, here's one more example of death by PowerPoint. I worked with an investment bank a number of years ago, and a very senior guy we were working with said, well, here's my slide. And I said, this isn't a slide. What this guy had done was he had actually just taken a page from the annual report, and he made a slide out of it. And once again, you see, this doesn't work, because I defy you to tell me what the 13th number in the 3rd row down on the bottom right says if you are sitting anywhere but right up against the screen, right? The question you have to ask yourself is quite literally, can the audience see what I'm putting on the screen here, right? Instead, he created a very, very simple graph, which, even if you're not an investment banker, helps you to understand fairly clearly how much money they made in these various sectors in that particular year. Now, a brief word on performance and delivery. When you're standing in front of an audience, I prefer, whenever possible, when I'm delivering a presentation, I prefer to work without a podium. Obviously, there are some situations in which you go in and a podium is already there, and you have to stand behind the podium. But whenever possible, if you can move around your space and make contact with all of the people in the room, if you have a wireless microphone, or if the space is small enough that you don't need a microphone, I'd like for you to stand upright and naturally pay attention to your posture and walk with purpose. Take a couple of steps over to one side of the audience and direct your comments to that side of the audience, right? Maintaining strong eye contact with individuals in the audience. Don't ever try to look at everyone in the audience all at once. Look at the gentleman in the third row on the left. And then maybe when you transition to another thought, then turn and look at another gentleman in the row on the right-hand side in the sixth row, right? Look at individuals in the audience in a somewhat unpredictable way. Use strong gestures. Don't keep your hands folded in front of yourself or behind your back. Get your hands up and be an animated, somewhat performing version of your regular self. And finally, don't turn your back to your audience. I really don't like it when people will turn their back to the audience and go over and point at the screen. I think it's much better if you can quite literally keep your body focused toward the audience and let the images on the screen speak for themselves. Now finally, how do you deal with questions and answers? At the end of a presentation, you've delivered all of your information very, very successfully, and then maybe there's some people in the audience who have some difficult questions. And sometimes these questions take particular and distinct forms. Somebody is what we call the hypothesizer. They ask you a hypothetical question. Where do you think your numbers will be 5 years from now? Or someone will be what we call the agreeer. Well, wouldn't you agree that what you're telling me is not exactly what we think it's going to be? Or someone will employ what we call the personalizer. We'll say, okay, well, that's the company's opinion, but how do you really personally feel about all of this, right? Or another person will require you to be what we call the omniscient authority. They expect you to know the answer to every question under the sun. Or perhaps they'll deliver the questions to you in what we call machine gun style. They'll ask you 5 questions in rapid-fire succession and expect you to answer all of the questions. Well, my advice for dealing with all styles of difficult questions is simply to keep in mind the fact that you are there to answer the questions. It's not about evading the questions, most certainly, but you do want to stay on course. You do want to, after politely and as briefly as possible, dealing with the audience's concerns, bridge back to what you want to talk about, to what you came to talk about in the first place. You want to build a verbal bridge back to your key messages. And so here are some of the bridges that we often hear. You'll hear President Obama occasionally say, well, the key point here is, or the fact of the matter is. And this bridge serves a couple of different purposes. It permits you to pivot back to where you want to go. And here's another page of them. You know, if somebody's asked a question and you don't particularly want to go down that particular road, you might say, well, what the question should be is, or that's a good question, but. And once again, I'm absolutely not saying that we want you to be evasive in any way. But these are some tools that permit you to get back to where you need to be. Now, people often ask me for suggestions as to where to see good presentations, examples of powerful presentations. Many of you may be familiar with something called TED.com. The TED conferences were begun a number of years ago in California, and now they're held all over the world. I can't remember what TED stands for. It's Technology, Education, and Design, I think, perhaps. But anyway, they bring a number of speakers to talk about business, to talk about technology and innovation and art and all kinds of fascinating things. And if you go to the TED.com website, you'll see a large library of excellent presentations, many of which employ some of the tools that I'm talking about today. Another website that I think has a lot of very, very useful information is something called presentationzen.com. If you go to this site, you'll get a lot of good ideas for story ideas, for visuals, and so forth. That's presentationzen.com. And finally, for a little bit of comic relief, there is a comedian, an American comedian in California named Don McMillan, who's got a number